Hey guys, this is Daniel from What Opie Plays, and today we're going to explore stretching your PlayStation 2 games from the native 4:3 aspect ratio to 3:2, so we can utilize the whole screen on devices such as the AYANEO Pocket Ace. I never had a PS2 growing up, but I played a lot of GBA games, which is what drew me to the Ace and its 3:2 display, but I am interested in playing through the PS2's massive library. The PS2 was originally designed for a 4:3 aspect ratio TV, with some later games adding native 16:9 support, so 3:2 scaling isn't perfect, but can still look acceptable. We'll be using the Nether SX2 version 2.0 emulator, which was recently updated earlier this year, and I'll leave the download link in the description if you don't already have it. Nether SX2 has widescreen cheat support, meaning we can hack a lot of the games that don't have native widescreen support so they can expand out to full screen with minimal distortion. I'll show you how to enable widescreen support for your games, and show off a handful of games I've personally been enjoying on the somewhat niche screen on my Ace. Before we get into how to stretch our games, I want to talk about why this might be a good idea in the first place. Typically, retro handhelds come with a 4:3 or 16:9 aspect ratio display, which works really well when playing content that matches those aspect ratios, such as playing PSP on the AYANEO Mini or SNES on the Trim UI brick. However, when trying to play 4:3 content on a 16:9 display or vice versa, you get these pretty substantial black bars. If we look at this graphical representation, we can see that given a 16:9 display that is 4.5 inches, when playing 4:3 content we only use 75% of the screen, giving us a relatively small 3.7-inch image, meaning we're wasting a lot of screen real estate and we have these really thick black bars that can be pretty distracting. The ratio is the same when doing the opposite, where we're playing 16:9 content in a 4:3 display. We still only utilize 75% of the pixels, although I would say the black bars along the top and bottom don't look nearly as bad as on the left and right, and we have a 4.1-inch image here. So if I had to choose between 4:3 and 16:9, I would pick 4:3 because you get a bigger diagonal image when playing 16:9, as well as it being more optimized for squarish platforms like Game Boy Color or Pico 8. The Trim UI brick isn't the greatest example here since the screen is pretty small, but it's the biggest 4:3 handheld I have, so I gotta work with what I got. However, there is a much better option for those who want to play a wider range of retro systems on a single handheld. 3:2 is known as a great middle ground aspect ratio since it minimizes the black bars when playing 4:3 and 16:9 content, such as PS2 and PSP. It's also the exact ratio for Game Boy Advance, which happens to be my favorite retro system, so maybe I'm a little biased here, but I promise I can back it up with facts. When playing 16:9 content on a 3:2 display like the Pocket Ace, we get a much bigger picture, where we're using 84% of the pixels and we only lose out on 0.2 inches on the diagonal. Playing 4:3 content, we get even more pixels with 89% of the screen real estate and a 4.2-inch diagonal. So if you plan on playing both 4:3 and 16:9 and want to minimize black bars without using overlays, 3:2 is a great choice. Now 3:2 will definitely minimize black bars, but they will still be there, and that might be distracting to you. This is where stretching comes in, and normally I'm an aspect ratio purist, and I go even further and I'll play most of my retro games integer scaled, even if that means I have black bars all around, because I like those perfect square pixels. However, I've started to come around on that with PS2 specifically, and I think we can achieve some pretty good results with widescreen support and then stretching to 3:2, so let's see how to do that. I'll be demonstrating games on the AYANEO Pocket Ace, but some other 3:2 handhelds out there include the Ambernic 34XX and 34XX SP, Powkiddy V10, and the AYANEO Pocket Micro and Micro Classic. Now let's see how to enable widescreen support in Nether SX2. I have a mouse connected to my Ace so my fingers won't get the screen dirty, and we'll open up the menu and go to App Settings. On the Graphics tab, if we scroll down to the Game Display section, we can see the Enable Widescreen Patches setting. We could simply toggle this on, which would enable it for all games, but I wouldn't do that. This option only works if there's a widescreen patch that the community has developed and Trixarian, the dev behind the Nether SX2 patch, has integrated into the patch. If we look at the zip file of widescreen patches on the Nether SX2 GitHub, we can see there are almost 4,200 patches, so more likely than not, the game you want to play will have a widescreen patch. However, the reason why I don't recommend enabling this at a global level is that these patches are typically designed specifically for 16:9, and you might not like how it looks when forced to 3:2. I think it's better to try out widescreen patches for each game and then decide on if you like how it looks. To enable this on a per game basis, you can launch the game, press the back button to access the menu, and then tap on the eye icon to access the game specific settings. The other way is to tap and hold on the game in the game list and then select game properties. Changing any of these settings will only apply to the current game, but if you tap on the gear icon, that will change settings globally. Some games like God of War or Shadow of the Colossus increase the rendered field of view, or FOV, when widescreen patches are enabled, meaning you basically get additional horizontal space for free. Then, stretching it to 3x2, the image will be stretched about 15% vertically to fill the screen, resulting in a slight distortion. This can make characters look a little bit taller, but for most games will still look pretty good. You will probably notice a distortion more in menus. Sometimes menus will still render in 4x3 like Devil May Cry 3. They might also have weird rendering due to the changes like on this tutorial screen. It's important to know that there is no perfect scaling to a 3x2 display, so there will always be some level of distortion, but games that handle widescreen patches by increasing the FOV tend to look the best. Ratchet and Clank is one of those games that fakes widescreen support by simply squashing the image vertically to create a 16:9 image. The image is then stretched again vertically to 3x2, which removes some of the distortion but still results in a warped image. This is probably the worst kind of widescreen support since you don't have the benefit of increased horizontal FOV and the distortion is worse. It can still look okay when stretched, but it will really depend on the game. FMVs are pre-rendered cutscenes, which if you don't know stands for full motion video. I certainly didn't know that before making this video. Since these are pre-rendered, they won't change when applying a widescreen patch, so stretching them to 3x2 will make things look wider than normal, as if Titus here had gained a few pounds. We can fix this by going into the per game settings, and under the aspect ratio setting, there is an FMV aspect ratio setting. Change this to standard 4x3 and you'll have to reset your game for the changes to take effect. An easy way to do this is to create a save state, then open the pause menu, scroll down, and hit reset console. Then once the game starts loading, load your save state and continue gaming. Now that we understand how widescreen patches work and how to apply them on a per game basis, let's see some of the games I've been playing with these patches. Ace Combat 5: The Unsung War lets you jump into the pilot seat of several different fighter jets and blow up other planes, helicopters, tanks, and other ground targets. Every Ace Combat game mostly feels the same, where the story can mostly be ignored and I can just focus on living out my Top Gun fantasies. This game doesn't have an in-game widescreen option, but we can enable the widescreen cheats in the game-specific settings. If we toggle that on and resume the game, we can see that the FOV has increased. However, it definitely looks vertically squashed, so if we go back to the settings and set the aspect ratio to stretch fill screen, then it looks so much better. This is a great first game to show off the widescreen support because after tweaking, the radar is still circular as well as our targeting reticle, and now we have increased visibility, which for a fighter pilot is always a good thing. Black is a first-person shooter that I've been meaning to play through, and is consistently in every top PS2 games list I've seen. I did play a little bit here and there, and it definitely shows its age, but it still looks pretty fun. Enabling widescreen squashes the image vertically to create a 16:9 image, but once we scale it to 3x2, it looks decent. There is definitely still some vertical distortion, but overall it's not that distracting, at least for me. I notice it mostly in menus where the button icons are slightly oval-shaped. Burnout is always a fun game, and I played a lot of Burnout Legends on PSP as a kid. Burnout 3 on the PS2 is an example of where you might just want to keep it at 4x3. If we start a race and then go into the menu to enable widescreen patches, we can see that the HUD is completely broken. The position marker and boost meter has shifted toward the center, and the lap counter and speedometer have partially shifted off screen. Stretching this to 3x2 wouldn't make it any better, so for this game I would just play at the native 4x3 aspect ratio. I watched a lot of Kim Possible growing up, but I didn't know they had made video games based on the show. This seems like a fun little platformer, and I can't wait to continue playing this. This game is an example of how widescreen patches squash the image, and stretching to 3x2 brings back a little of that distortion. It does make Kim a little thicker, and also the communicator is wider, but for this kind of game I don't think you would really notice it much, since the screen is fairly zoomed out and Kim is relatively small on screen. Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly is a game I never would have considered playing if I weren't testing out games for this video, because I do not like anything horror. Horror movies, horror games, Halloween Horror Nights, I hate anything scary. However, I found this game to be super interesting. It's about these two sisters, Mio and Mayu, exploring a haunted village. There's ghosts you kill with a Polaroid camera, and overall it's just got this really creepy atmosphere that's not overly scary, at least for how much I played so far. I actually didn't know you could run in this game, so I spent the first hour literally walking at a snail's pace through the different rooms in the first house, which made it all the more creepy. Widescreen is a pretty similar squash and restretch, but I think it actually looks better with the slight distortion. For example, the patches do a good job of preserving the menus and button glyphs. In the camera view, originally the reticle is actually slightly oval shaped in the native 4x3, but with the patches it looks a little more circular, which I think looks better and feels more like a camera lens. Final Fantasy X is a classic JRPG and one of the best Final Fantasy games ever made, at least in my opinion. I thought the story was really good, the music tracks were excellent, and I don't think this game deserves the hate it gets for the laughing scene. This is another vertical squashing game, although I think the characters look abnormally thin in 4x3, and squashing to 16:9 actually makes them look normal. So stretching back to 3x2 looks pretty good to me. And make sure you set the FMV aspect ratio to 4x3 so you don't break cutscenes. God of War is a fun hack and slash game, and I've been slowly playing through God of War Ragnarok on PS5, but it's nice to be able to play the original games. I appreciate God of War for when I need to turn my brain off and just hit things. This is also the game I used to demonstrate the controller vibration issue in my Pocket Ace impressions video, where inputs were getting ignored while the vibration motor was active. I'm happy to report that AYANEO has recently fixed this issue, so you just need to update your controller software via IS setting, and they've also fixed the sound level issue as well. With widescreen patches and stretching, Kratos looks a little wider, but the rest of the game looks pretty good. The circles in the game, like on the pause menu, are still mostly circular and only ever so slightly oval shaped. I was never that big a fan of GTA, it never really connected with me. All I understood from this game when I was a kid was that you go around hijacking cars, beating up people, and trying not to get wasted by the cops, which I guess kinda sums up these games perfectly. This game is interesting from an aspect ratio perspective, since in 4x3 the radar at the bottom left is already oval shaped. We can see here it's not a perfect circle. Make sure you don't enable the in-game widescreen mode, that really seems to interfere with the widescreen patches. Enabling the widescreen patches gives us a massive FOV boost, and we can see much more of the surrounding houses here. Stretching it to 3x2 makes our character look normal again. The radar is still slightly squished, but I can accept that since it wasn't a perfect circle to begin with. Ratchet and Clank is probably my favorite PlayStation franchise ever. I absolutely love the gameplay loop of running around, smashing everything in sight, collecting the bolts, leveling up your weapons, and buying new weapons to dispatch your enemies in new and wacky ways. I remember playing the first Ratchet and Clank level and absolutely loving it, although I didn't actually beat an entire game until I played Rift Apart earlier this year, which was an amazing game, both graphically and gunplay wise. I didn't play going Commando, so I'm experiencing it now for the first time and really enjoying it. Enabling widescreen patches does a similar vertical squash, but the patches mitigate that effect by slightly zooming in on the world, which you can see here by the top of Ratchet's ship getting a little cut off. However, the HUD and weapon quick select are definitely squashed, so stretching to 3x2 will make that look a little better. Shadow of the Colossus is a game all about bosses. There are no random encounters, no grinding, no looting, inventory management, just a simple goal: defeat the 16 Colossi so you can revive your sister. It's a refreshingly simple and straightforward game in contrast to many of today's open world games, and a game that for the longest time I could not get into. I have started and dropped this game multiple times, and it was only a few weeks ago that I actually tried to play for more than 30 minutes, and I managed to beat the first 2 Colossi. This game does not have widescreen cheats, but it does have an in-game 16:9 option. If we enable this and then back out, we can see our character is a little thinner, and you can easily tell because the horse is skinnier. The FOV is slightly wider, so you can see just a little bit more of the world. The HUD maintains its aspect ratio, and the grip meter is circular, and the weapon box is a perfect square. So it's a little weird because it seems like the game adjusts the character model and FOV to accommodate widescreen, but the HUD remains sized for 4x3, and I think we can predict what's going to happen when stretching to 3x2. Now, since stretching it to 3x2 only stretches it a little bit horizontally, the HUD doesn't look too bad. It's no longer a perfect circle and square, but it's not so distorted that it's distracting. But the character model looks closer to the 4x3 model, and we have the expanded FOV, which is nice. At the beginning of this year, I played through the modern Tomb Raider trilogy, and I really enjoyed those games. I was happy to find there were Tomb Raider games on the PS2, so I had to try this game out. It definitely shows its age, and I'm still at the beginning, but it's a lot of fun so far. This game also does not have widescreen patches, but if we enable progressive scan in the in-game settings, it naturally sets the aspect ratio to 3x2, filling our screen. This alone is pretty good, and Lara basically looks the same. I can barely tell the difference. But if we enable widescreen mode in the settings, we get a massive FOV boost, and we can also see so much more of the world now. This looks really great, and I can't wait to continue playing through this game. Let's talk about some positives and negatives of stretching. Widescreen patches combined with 3x2 stretching fills out the entire screen. It's a more immersive gaming experience and you can utilize all the pixels you paid for. You don't have any black bars, which can be very distracting. Some games will give you increased FOV, further increasing that immersion since you can see more of the world you're in. A game like Ace Combat definitely benefits from more FOV so you can spot those bogeys earlier, and in Shadow of the Colossus you can find the path for the next Colossus. Some games even have built-in widescreen support, and combined with a progressive scan option also gives you an FOV boost that fills the screen with minimal distortion, like in Tomb Raider Underworld. However, it's not all positive. While in most cases the widescreen patches and 3x2 stretching could look pretty decent, it still results in some distortion. Since I never owned a real PS2, I don't have these core memories of how these games used to look and feel. So if you grew up playing these games on this system, it can be somewhat jarring to have things stretched and look a little off. Not every game will have a widescreen patch, so you're at the mercy of the devs if they included an in-game widescreen option. Some games like Burnout can completely break when you enable widescreen patches, where the HUD layout becomes completely skewed and you're basically stuck playing those games at 4x3. And since FMV cutscenes are pre-baked, you can't change those with patches, so those will stay at 4x3, which might be jarring if the game is switching between 3x2 and 4x3. So what do you think about PS2 games on the AYANEO Pocket Ace? Let me know in the comments section below that like button. And if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing, as 95% of my viewers are not subscribed and it will really help the channel grow. The 3x2 aspect ratio is much more versatile and can display not only 3x2 content but 4x3 and 16:9 content with minimal black bars. It's a great choice when you want to play many different systems across handheld and console generations, especially when compared to playing 4x3 games on a 16:9 display or vice versa. Stretching isn't perfect and will almost always result in some slight distortion, and some games will still need to play in 4x3. You'll have to test widescreen patches with each game to see if it renders well, but I hope you enjoyed seeing some of the games I've personally been playing these last few weeks. I am still working on my final review for the Pocket Ace, and I also have the AYANEO Flip 1S DS that's shipping very soon, so I'll be sure to make an impressions and teardown video for that as well. So subscribe if you want to see that. Thanks for watching and have a great day.